Welcome back to Automation Stage. And now we will have a presentation from Lee Barnes, the Chief Quality Officer at Forte Group, and he will be presenting what is a successful test automation is and why it's not a testing. So, the stage is yours.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining this talk. Certainly much appreciated everyone's time. Let me start by telling you a little bit about myself. As we just heard, I'm Chief Quality Officer at Forte Group. I am involved in software testing now for over 25 years. Most of that time has been focused on test automation and performance. I think before we get started, it's a good idea to talk about my journey into software testing. I'll help you give a little bit of a background and context into this talk. Early in my career, I transitioned from aerospace engineering to software testing. And while in the aerospace field, I did a lot of independent validation and verification work in my area of expertise, which was structural dynamics. And this work involved ensuring that analyses performed by other aerospace companies were correct, both from an approach and a results perspective. And of course, in that industry, there's very low tolerance for defects. I moved to a large consulting company when I left aerospace, and just by chance was assigned to a software testing group. And through that, I was exposed to both our internal approach to software testing as well as that of many of our clients. And I was really shocked at what they called software testing. Extremely sloppy practices that revolved mostly around executing scripted test steps. And while that was shocking, I think what was worse was their tolerance for defects. I certainly understood that the consequences were typically less for software, especially from the human life perspective, but these systems were still mission critical to the business. And I had found that most organizations were spending more time thinking about how they would resolve defects than how they would prevent them or detect them early. And I had a really hard time with this. My goal when I was performing validation and verification work in the aerospace industry was to find problems, either in the analysis approach or, of course, the results. And not just the most critical defects, but really all the problems. And now it seemed that my career was going to consist of creating a set of instructions that would be blindly followed over and over again with little chance of ever finding any real issues. Before I gave up, I decided to do some research on software testing. And while there was certainly materials that reinforced the same shallow practices that I was seeing, I found there were some real thought leaders in this space that treated software testing as much more of a science or engineering discipline. And I'm talking like about people like Boris Beiser, who wrote Software Testing Techniques, and Brian Merrick, who wrote The Craft of Software Testing, and even Sem Kaner, who wrote the Testing Computer Software book. They approach software testing in a very similar way that we approached validation and verification in the engineering space. A very scientific way, using critical thinking, using their knowledge, using their expertise to design experiments with the purpose of exposing problems in systems. From there, I really started to build a solid foundation in my software testing approach through this research and experimentation on my projects. And in some cases, it wasn't well accepted because I wasn't doing things the standard way. But in many instances, I was able to show the value of finding problems over just proving that the software still worked. And from there, I began to transition my focus specifically onto test automation and performance testing. And again, I found myself fighting a battle with mediocrity, quite frankly. The approach to test automation and performance testing just was being driven largely by tool vendors. And unfortunately, their goal was to sell more software, not find problems with yours. However, the foundation I had built early on in software testing allowed me to see these tools for really what they were, just enabler of things that I wanted to do in software testing. And that really allowed me to differentiate myself from others that were simply going along with the message that the tool vendors were trying to get us to believe. So hopefully now everyone's got a bit of a context of where I came from, and I think it will help with understanding where this talk comes from. So let's move on and take a look at what I call effective software testing. So in order to think about what effective software testing is, I think we should all be on the same page. So let's look at this definition. And there's certainly others, but this is one that has really resonated with me over the years. We see terms like knowledge, experience, critical thinking, designing experiments. But most importantly, I think it states the purpose is to expose issues in software systems. And notice it doesn't mention anything about creating a repeatable set of scripted steps, right, that can be executed by anyone with or without any application knowledge. And of course, you could argue that critical thinking could have gone into the process that created those scripts. But my experience is that very often those test scripts, automated or otherwise, are based on happy path scenarios for the most part that are going to be executed hundreds of times over the course of a development project. And really, eventually not providing any new valuable information. So let's maybe qualify that definition a little bit to get to a definition of what I would call effective software testing. First, I think it should be aligned with your business goals, right? We shouldn't be testing in a vacuum simply for the sake of testing. We're trying to defend the value, essentially, of the system that we're building. So our testing should be driven by the business goals that the system has. And similarly, we should be smart about how we utilize our limited testing resources, because even automated testing has limits. Right? We shouldn't be dedicating our resources to areas that of less risk or below our risk tolerance. Second, effective software testing should be giving us information that is relevant to making decisions about the quality of the product that we're testing. And I think one way to judge the effectiveness of specific tests is to ask yourself if you're comfortable with not having the information that test provides. If you're okay with that, probably the test isn't too valuable to you. And finally, tests should support the need for fast feedback. I'm not necessarily talking about execution speed, although that's certainly a factor. I'm more talking about the efficiency of determining the outcome of a test. If the test isn't deterministic, or if it's difficult to understand what happened to cause a specific result, you're spending a lot of time chasing that information and really lengthening that feedback loop. So as we move on to discuss test automation, let's keep these definitions in mind, because a bit later I want to compare effective test automation with effective software testing, just to dispel a common myth around that. So let's talk about the current state of automation. And now, before I go on and risk offending a bunch of us out here, I want to say that there are certainly exceptions to the generalizations that I'm about to make. But I definitely see a lot of these issues as I work with clients in the test automation area. So let's start by looking at the most important factors in determining test automation approach. This data here is from the 2022 World Quality Report, so fairly fresh data. There may look like there's no surprises here, right? Maintainability is at the top of the list, and maintainability has always been a huge concern, right? Ever since I started getting into test automation over 25 years ago. However, the most important data on this chart is what I've hidden from you. And that is that only 26% of the respondents state that value received from automation is among their top 3 factors in determining their automation approach. And that's actually surprising to me. Based on my experience, I would have guessed that it actually would have been lower. In my opinion, the value you get from automation should be your number 1 goal. But as we see, it's just not there. So how do we get here? I often say this, but I blame the tool vendors again. Going back to the very beginning of test automation, they've always wanted us to think that their tool was the solution to our testing problems. So they forced us into feature comparisons and comparing ease of use between tools. And I think we're still thinking that way, as evidenced by this data, right? We're focusing on things that maybe aren't as valuable to us. So before I go on and look at some characteristics of effective test automation, I think it's important to discuss some common test automation myths that really have been perpetuated for decades. But I think until we can dispel those myths, we're going to have some big obstacles to overcome before we can truly see the benefit that we all desire from test automation. So looking at some common myths and beliefs and try to compare those to what I see the reality being, starting with tools again. Most discussions that I have around test automation begin with questions around tools or frameworks. But the reality is there are a lot of foundational factors that need to be in place for test automation to be effective and successful. Of course, your tool needs to support your technology and your objectives. But in my experience, it's really number 5 or 6 down the list of things of importance that you need to think about to implement effective test automation. We'll talk about them a little later on. Another one of the first questions that I get when talking to organizations about test automation is around the number or percentage of tests that should be automated. Stating up front that you're going to automate 100% or any arbitrary percentage, for that matter, of test cases is often going to send you down the wrong path. Rather, you should think about automation more generally, right? Not just about automating the number of tests, but other activities, and we'll spend some time talking about that as well. My answer to this question is you should automate 100% of the tests that should be automated. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I try to get people to think about why you're automating. We'll dive into detail on that as well. Another myth that I see is around the number of defects that you'll find. I often hear organizations justify test automation initiatives by stating some extrapolated metric around the projected number of issues that will be found. If we found this many with manual testing, the number must be much, much bigger if we automate. But the reality is that executing automated checks shouldn't really find more problems than a human tester. And there's a statistic, I believe it came from the Software Testing Techniques book by Boris Beiser, that says the likelihood of a test that has already passed once detecting an issue on future executions is less than 3%. So if you find that your automated checks are continuously finding issues, real issues, you probably have some real serious issues upstream in your delivery cycle that you need to deal with. And finally, I see a lot of people still focusing on the UI level in terms of test automation, right? That test automation is just simply automating the same steps that a human tester would do. And again, this myth is heavily influenced by tool vendors, right? Who back in the day, when we think about when test automation market first emerged, that's all there was UI level automation tools. But even more recent tools that market self-healing tests and other features really meant to drag you back into feature wars and focused on automating whatever UI level test you already have without really thinking about the value they provide or how to best achieve those same test objectives through automation. So I think we need to talk about what's missing, right? If the state of test automation still isn't what we, in general anyway, still isn't what we want it to be, there's got to be something missing. And for some reason, we aren't prioritizing the value we receive from automation. We seem to be focused a lot on counting metrics again, the number, percentage of automated tests. And as a collective group, we still perpetuate those myths and others that I just talked about. So what's missing? In my experience, we just don't have clear objectives for what we're trying to do before we get started, or at least we don't have what I would call the correct objectives. When I ask stakeholders that I work with what they're trying to accomplish, I'm continually surprised by the responses I get, ranging from it's how everyone tests these days, or to the equally absurd, we need to reduce our tester headcount. But the problem is, right, if we don't have good objectives, we're just automating for the sake of automation. And instead of automation being a means to an end, automation is the end goal. And that's where I think we run into trouble. So we have to ask ourselves, how did we get here? And in my opinion, it's because we're asking the wrong questions up front of ourselves, right? These questions are born out of the myths we discussed earlier. Things like, what tools should we use? Certainly an important question at some point, but probably not the first question. Again, what percentage of tests should we automate? What types of tests should we automate? Again, some of these questions are going to be necessary at some point, but when we start with them, we get going down the wrong path because we're really not marching toward the right goal. We really should be asking ourselves, what metric, what needle are we trying to move? And again, we're not automating for the sake of automation. There should be some valuable end goal that we're chasing. In my opinion, those are the wrong questions, but the right one is implementing automation to enable us to achieve goals that are much closer to our business goals. Things like increase our release cadence so we can deliver value to our customers faster, or freeing up our high value testers so they can focus on finding problems, not executing the same set of regression tests over and over and over again. So again, we just want to ask better questions up front. How can I use test automation to support my business? And of course, by inclusion, my software development goals as well. Before I go on, I mentioned counting metrics and the percentage of test cases automated and why I don't think that's a good idea. But I do want to acknowledge there's certainly a practical reason that so many organizations focus on counting metrics as the goal for test automation versus maybe metrics that better represent the value that automation provides. I think it's just simply easier to measure things like numbers or percentages, right? We just don't have to think too deeply about that. We gather the numbers and we report them. And in general, we're a very metric-driven industry, and I completely understand the desire to keep things very simple and very clean. However, the easy, clean approach isn't always the best answer. Is it easy to directly measure the impact of an automated test suite on your release frequency? No, because there are a lot of other factors that would go into that, right? However, that metric is much closer to the value that you're delivering to your customers. You might not get to measure and broadcast an exact number, but I think that's okay. You're going to know if ineffective test automation is slowing down your delivery cycle. You're going to feel that. And similarly, you're going to be able to see that effective test automation is enabling acceleration in your delivery cycle. It's going to be a qualitative observation, but do you really care if you're accomplishing your overall goal? So I just wanted to get out there and certainly acknowledge that I understand why people are driven by counting metrics and the such, but I found much more success focusing on moving goals that are much more closer to the value that I'm trying to get to my customers. So now let's take a look at what effective test automation looks like, because really having the right objectives is only the first step. We have to implement, maintain, enhance our test automation suites in an effective way. So let's take a look. I think first and foremost, as we discussed, we want test automation to be a means to an end, right? The end being delivering value to our customers. So it really needs to support our business goals. Next, we want our automated test suites to contain high value activities and tests. A lot of times we're chasing counting metrics again, right, for our automation initiative, and we end up with tests that provide little value because we're more interested in making that number go up than actually understanding the value of those tests we're automating. Test automation also needs to be reliable and provide fast feedback. Reliable means that it can be executed on demand and doesn't suffer from what I would call irrelevant failures, which are failures of the test that have nothing to do with the application or issues in the application. And of course, the results need to be accurate. Fast feedback means the tests don't run an unnecessarily long time. They don't require long analysis cycles. And I think fast feedback comes from a few areas, making sure that we only include, of course, tests that we need, right? Any unnecessary tests are just lengthening our feedback loop. We design our tests in a good way. And finally, providing easy to consume and actionable information so we can triage our results. And of course, test automation is not a fire and forget solution. It's important to extend a culture of continuous improvement to test automation as well, not just your delivery process. You need to make sure that your test automation activities continue to be aligned with your business goals. And of course, you're going to find better ways of doing things and identifying and removing obstacles to effective test automation, inefficiencies. And you want that to be a continuous process as you develop your product. And finally, test automation should allow testers to focus on high value activities versus, again, executing the same set of steps over and over again. And of course, these activities allow us to achieve the most important goal of software testing, and that's finding problems. So I want to dive in to some of those a little bit deeper because I see a few of these as most impactful to effective test automation. I talked about tests, including tests that only provide value, and getting rid of tests that don't provide information that we don't necessarily need. So let's look at how we can evaluate if tests are really worthy to be in our test suite. Bas Dijkstra, who's an automation engineer out of the Netherlands, has come up with a great acronym, in my opinion, for reminding us about the qualities that we should look for when we're trying to determine if tests should be part of an automated test suite. And that's FITR. It stands for focused, informative, trustworthy, and repeatable. Focus refers to testing functionality as close as we possibly can to where it's implemented. So if you have functionality inside of an API or a service or an endpoint that you're trying to test, trying to test that through the UI is probably going to be pretty inefficient, not only from a speed perspective, but also what if you find issues? Is the issue in the API? Is it somewhere between the API and the UI? We just don't know, right? And now we've set ourselves up for a long analysis cycle. So focusing your test on the actual location that you're trying to test as close as possible provides big benefits. Informative means that test should be as self-documented as possible. Someone looking at it should really understand what it's trying to accomplish. For the output, the logging, the reporting should provide feedback as to what happened if an issue is encountered, right? If a test encounters an issue related to not being able to locate a UI element, I don't want to see a stack trace. I want to know what field we're trying to find. I want to know the locator we were using and probably a screenshot. And that's going to get me, in most cases, all I need to figure out what happened. Trustworthy is a big one, right? If you're going to be part of a build pipeline, right, where your tests are executed automatically based on some event, they need to be trusted. And if they can't be trusted, they're going to lose that privilege of being part of the pipeline, right? So you need your tests to be reliable and accurate, and then they will become trustworthy. And finally, repeatable. If your tests are going to be automatically kicked off by some event that you're not controlling, they need to be ready to go on demand. And this usually means that we've taken care of test environment and data management, and we'll discuss that next. So Effective test automation, as we talked about, must be reliable and provide fast feedback. And an important contributor to these characteristics is stable test environments and data. And I like to talk about this using what I call the test environment and data spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, we have the old static shared environments that are created and persist for a long time. And I still see a lot of organizations implementing agile DevOps processes that are still working with these old environments. But these type of environments cause a lot of issues because they're shared. That causes instability in the data. Maybe someone changes data underneath someone else, and now we have some issues. We might have scheduling conflicts in terms of different types of testing that we want to execute in that environment. And probably it's not very production-like, very often not in size or shape, but also maybe no one ever quite knows exactly what the configuration is, which leads to long analysis cycles. And these issues really are the root cause of ineffective test automation, right? Data instability results in unreliable execution. Because we can't rely on the data, maybe we're forced to set up data each time and for each test in a meticulous manner. And that really doesn't sound like fast feedback. Data or configuration issues can lead to false positives or worse, false negatives. And all this results in a ridiculously long time for analysis, right? Because you're really not sure if issues are actually issues or what caused them. So let's take a look at the other end of the environment and data spectrum, where we have dynamic, dedicated, fresh environments. These really support effective test automation, or go a long way in supporting effective test automation, right? They're dynamic, so we can create them on demand using virtualization or infrastructure as code techniques. Because they're easier to create and manage, we can likely have more of them and dedicate them to specific functions and eliminate any issues associated with sharing environments. For the same reasons, we can make them production-like, if we want, anyway, or at least be in a state where everyone is working maybe in separate but identical environments. And we eliminate a lot of, well, it works on my machine problems. And since we're creating that environment on demand, maybe we can also ensure that it has the data we need in the right state that we need it. So definitely data and environments are a huge issue with effective or with blocking us from effective test automation. Can't say enough that this is an area you really need to look at to further your automation goals. So moving on, it's not just enough to have the good objectives, have the right goals, ensure that you're getting the right tests in your test suite, and that you've put the right foundational factors like environment and data stability in place. You really need to understand the details of what you're implementing and think critically about them. And a good way to do that is what I call the test suite canvas. And this is a concept that's not mine. It was introduced by Katrina Clokey, who has a wonderful testing and DevOps book, by the way. And this particular version I saw presented by Ashley Hunsberger a handful of years ago. The idea behind the test suite canvas is to think about important aspects of the test suite so we can first determine if we need it at all, and then assuming we do, figuring out what it's going to do and how we're going to implement it. I think there's one of the myths that I didn't discuss earlier, but is a very important one, is that test automation is just something that test automation engineers do, and the organization as a whole doesn't really need to worry about it. But this should be a group exercise, right? Not just the automation engineer. And it really does a good job of helping the organization understand all the details and all the things they need to think about to be to implement effective test automation. Right? It's easy to say, oh, we're going to have an API integration test or an end-to-end test suite, and really not think about all the details that need to be in place for that to be created and to be maintained and supported and enhanced over time. So you can see here on the canvas, things like the purpose, dependencies. What systems is this going to be dependent on? What might be blocking us from implementing this in an ideal way? When are we going to execute it? How are we going to manage environments and data, etc.? These are all important things that we should be thinking about before we implement the test suite. And again, more at a team or organization level, because as you can see, all these things are not something, at least in most cases, that an automation engineer is going to be able to control. So we talked a lot about effective test automation, and although I didn't speak specifically too much about executing tests, you probably were thinking a lot about, okay, automation means executing tests. But the reality is that we perform a lot of activities as part of software testing. So let's take a look at them, right? These are all things that we might do as part of our software testing day-to-day activities. They can all be automated in some way, shape, or form, right? So by broadening our definition and thinking more generally about test automation, we can identify more opportunities to benefit from it. So similarly, let's take a look at test automation tools and see if we can broaden our definition there. I put together here a list that we can consider to be testing tools, right? And as you can see, UI automation software is in there, and I purposely put it in the middle or toward the end to make a point, right? I think as an industry, we're very focused on tools, whether they're commercial or open source, but they're just very narrowly focused in what they do. Really, anything you can use or even build to make testing activity more efficient or more effective is a testing tool. I think the underlying message here is just don't assume that your existing or favorite solution is what you need. And certainly don't try to force that solution onto your problem, right? At that point, you're just a hammer looking for nails, and you can lead yourself down a bad path. I've seen a lot of situations where a lot of effort and a lot of money was spent using just a UI automation tool to automate everything. And maybe you can get it to work, but the issues that you're going to encounter in flakiness and in maintainability and in execution speed, just to name a few, is not likely going to be worth the effort. So before we wrap up and talk about take some questions, I want to talk about the impact that I see test automation having on software testing as a discipline. With such a huge focus on automating everything and those myths and naive approaches that many organizations take, I see very little attention being paid to software testing as a craft, right? Going back to some of those books I mentioned earlier, Software Testing Techniques and The Craft of Software Testing. So let's take another look at the definition of software testing. It talks about thinking critically and designing experiments for the purpose of exposing systems. But this just isn't executing scripted test steps that were derived and probably from poorly defined acceptance criteria. But that's exactly what most organizations have in their automated test suite. And in many cases, organizations are satisfied with those tests just being green, right? There isn't much more testing being done after that. But if we contrast that to this general definition of automation, which is operating or controlling a process through automated means, hopefully reducing human intervention, I think we can clearly see that test automation is not software testing. And there's a real danger in relying on those green check marks from your automated test suite and not really spending any time trying to find problems in your software. So I really see kind of these naive approaches to test automation and the race to automate everything, swallowing up the craft of software testing. There's just not a focus in organizations to deeply test software and do it in a very very critical way. So before we take questions, I just briefly want to talk about some key takeaways. And I think first and foremost, understand what effective test automation is, right? Start with supporting your business and development goals. Otherwise, you're just automating for the sake of automation. It's got to be reliable and provide fast feedback. Controlling your test environments and data goes a long way to being reliable. Also, testing as closely to the functionality that you're targeting goes a long way to help as well, especially in fast feedback. Provide valuable information. All right, so think critically about what tests you're putting in your automated test suite. Don't chase some number or percentage of tests. You want 100% of the tests that should be automated, that are worthy to be automated, to be in your test suite. And finally, it should be allowing your testers who have domain knowledge and application knowledge and hopefully understand software testing techniques to focus on finding problems, those higher value activities. I think a lot of this can be prevented. A lot of those myths and ineffective test automation can be prevented if we avoid shallow and naive questions when we're trying to set our objectives. And as we just mentioned, if we can broaden our definition of test automation, right, by thinking not just about executing scripted test steps, but by thinking more broadly about what testing activities can benefit from automation. And finally, continuously improve. I think, especially in agile DevOps cultures, continuous improvement is a foundation of that. But sometimes I don't see that extended to the test automation implementations. It should be, right? You're going to find ways to improve this just as you are going to find ways to improve every other aspect of your software delivery. All right, so with that, we can take some questions.
And thank you, Lee. A lot of things that you mentioned also resonates with my beliefs and what I think as well. So it's very nice to get the verification from you about those as well. We have 9 questions, and we can start with the most upvoted one. And Sini wants your advice on this. How would you advise a company project to start a test automation if they have no experience, early experience, or knowledge?
So that's a very good question. I think in a lot of ways, having no experience or knowledge puts you in an advantage. You don't have, a lot of times I see people start automation efforts with whatever they've done in the past and not really thinking about how it applies to what they're trying to do now. So my best advice would be to understand first how ready you are for automation. Can you control your test environments and data? Can automation be part of the way you deliver software as opposed to something that sits out in the side? So how are you going to understand within your delivery process identify what tests should be automated and what impact changes in your delivery cycle might have to automated testing? What skills and resources do you have that might contribute to automation? Do you have someone with some development knowledge or some testing knowledge that can participate? And then develop a strategy. What part of the application am I going to start with? And what am I trying to achieve there? Is it because testing is a bottleneck and we have this regression test that we get bottled up with every sprint and I'm trying to reduce that bottleneck? Or is it something else? So understand what development or business metric you're trying to move and align automation with that. So that strategy should then start talking about, okay, addressing any gaps in readiness that you identified, and then just put a backlog of items for you to for you to implement. I think another good piece of advice that I've received and I found it to be effective is treat automation the same way you're treating your delivery cycle. If you are if you're developing software in an agile way, right? We're not getting all the specs done at the beginning and then marching toward the end without any changes. And you should approach automation in the same way. You might not do things perfect the first time, but you're going to realize that and adjust and enhance as you go. So again, continuously improve, take an agile approach to implementation, and as opposed to trying to set a direction, kind of an end goal, and just blindly marching toward it.
Yeah,
Great
learn
question.
on the job. Learn
Yeah.
on the job. There's no better way to
Yes,
do that, right?
absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. We have another question, and this one is from Patricia. How do you evaluate if automated tests already implemented bring effective value? Is there any method to determine that? How do you explain to management when encountered such a situation?
So that's a great question. I think there's no easy answer. There's no easy solution to say, quickly understand the value of an automated test suite. I would say many organizations, that it becomes this kind of takes on a life of its own, and you execute it, and if it's green all the time, everyone gets this false sense of security that yes, it's doing its job, when no one really understands exactly the job it's doing. Inspecting the tests that are in there, are they providing real information? I've seen a lot of automated test suites where just very shallow validation, right? Not really looking for problems, making sure that items are there on the screen, but not validating, the appropriate, deeper value of that might be contained in those items, for instance. Getting a successful response from an API and not evaluating the information within that response. So inspecting the tests, unfortunately, right? It's not a quick and easy solution, but inspecting the test and making sure the information those tests are providing are valuable. I think what a lot of organizations will find is that they can probably reduce the number of tests that are automated by focusing tests just on valuable information. And also, I call it distilling your tests, right? Don't try to test things that should be tested at a service or an API level through the UI. Certainly, you may want to test the UI mechanics. You might want to do some visual testing, but design test cases that are purpose-built to find issues there, rather than just trying to execute whatever manual test you've had in an automated fashion.
Okay, yeah, makes a lot of sense, actually. Okay, so we have 2 minutes left. Let's take another question. So this one is from Shruti. How do you deal with market expectations of having various IT quality certifications, IS2QB? I feel sometimes that they are so much into textbook definitions that we actually use in organizations. Would love to hear it from someone who isn't coming from conventional computer science background.
That's a great question. I'm especially in the testing space, I am not a fan of certifications. I think they are generally, I won't say all, but generally, they're there to make money. They're not there necessarily to help people be better testers. The way certifications in other areas of our industry, security maybe, and other disciplines. I think if organizations are using electronic evaluation of resumes, for instance, and looking for certifications and rejecting those that don't have it automatically, there's not a whole lot we can do to get past that. But I think if you can go in with and be able to describe effective software testing and techniques and how you've used techniques to find real problems in the software, you're going to resonate with a lot of people. And I think as an industry, if we if we can, in a group, if we can focus on that rather than saying, hey, I've, kind of check the box type resumes. Well, if you've worked with these technologies, if you have these certifications, then you can come interview with me. I think that's just a bad approach to finding good people. And if we can focus more on the craft of software testing and talking about really why we're testing software, which is to find problems, I think we'll do a better job in getting, or we might do a better job in removing some of these kind of check the box, job hiring and recruiting processes. But I think if you can get to talk to someone and talk about the craft of software testing and how you've used software testing and other techniques to find problems, you're going to resonate with a lot of people, independent of what certifications they're looking for.
Yes, totally agree with that. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. We didn't manage to answer all the questions. Thank you, Lee. It was very useful, and I think that it will be useful for listeners and attendees as well. I invite you to join the keynote in 4 minutes, which is happening in this automation channel, and Rick Marcellus will be talking about quality engineering strategy to grow from testing to built-in quality. And that's it. Thank you, and see you in a few minutes.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Feel free to contact me there with any additional questions if we didn't get to them.
Sure.
Yep. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.